Ethan Miller could see the gleaming skyscrapers of downtown Riverdale from the rooftop of the community center. Every night after helping Mrs. Patterson lock up, he would climb the rusty fire escape and sit on the edge, legs dangling over Willow Street as he watched the city lights flicker to life. From this distance, the towering glass buildings looked like something from another world. A world that might as well have been on another planet, despite being just a few miles away. "You up there again, Ethan?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried. From below, a hint of worry mingling with her natural warmth. "Yes, ma'am," he called back, not taking his eyes off the skyline. "Don't stay too late, the temperature's dropping." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. At 19, he was technically an adult, but the residents of East Riverdale, particularly Mrs. Patterson, still treated him like the orphaned 12-year-old who'd shown up at the community center 7 years ago after his mother's passing. The neighbors had collectively raised him, offering what little they had: a place to sleep, food to eat, and most importantly, a sense of belonging. "One day," he whispered to himself, his breath forming small clouds in the chilly October air, "one day I'll cross that bridge." The Riverdale Bridge separated East Riverdale from the wealthy downtown area, both physically and symbolically. East Riverdale was all brick buildings with peeling paint, corner stores with reinforced windows, and people who worked twice as hard for half as much. Downtown was all glass and steel, luxury cars, and people who seemed to float through life with an ease Ethan couldn't comprehend. He worked at Thompson's auto shop during the day, fixing cars with parts they salvaged from the junkyard. At night, he took online classes through Riverdale Community College, studying business and economics, with a second-hand laptop Mrs. Patterson had gifted him for his 18th birthday. The community center's spotty Wi-Fi was his lifeline to education, his ticket out, or so he hoped. As the temperature continued to drop, Ethan reluctantly stood up. His worn sneakers scraped against the gravel rooftop as he turned to leave, taking one last look at the skyline. Tomorrow would be another day of oil changes and tire rotations, of dreaming about a future that seemed just as distant as those skyscrapers. But fate had other plans. The next morning brought an unusual buzz to the community center. Mrs. Patterson was standing at the door holding an envelope with Ethan's name written in elegant cursive. "This came for you," she said, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern, hand-delivered by a man in a suit who wouldn't say much. Ethan took the envelope, feeling its weight and texture. It was made of thick, cream-colored paper that felt expensive between his calloused fingers. His name was written in gold ink that caught the morning light. "Well, open it," urged Tina, a high school senior who volunteered at the center. Other residents had gathered around, equally curious about this unexpected delivery. With careful movements, Ethan broke the wax seal and pulled out a card. The paper was even more luxurious than the envelope, with gold embossing along the edges. "It's an invitation," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "to the birthday celebration of Jackson Thompson." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Everyone in Riverdale knew the Thompson name. William Thompson wasn't just wealthy, he was Riverdale's wealthiest resident, a real estate mogul who owned half the buildings downtown and was rumored to be eyeing properties in East Riverdale for urban renewal, a phrase that sent shivers down the spines of the community. "Jackson Thompson," Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed. "That's William Thompson's son. What business would he have inviting you to his party?" Ethan shook his head, equally confused. "I have no idea. I've never even met him." "Maybe he brought his car into the shop," suggested Marco, Ethan's co-worker from Thompson's auto shop, no relation to the wealthy Thompsons. "The Thompsons don't drive cars that need fixing at our shop," Ethan replied with a dry laugh. Mrs. Patterson took the invitation, reading it carefully. "This Saturday at the Thompson estate, black tie." She looked at Ethan with concern. "This doesn't make sense. People like them don't invite people like us to their parties without a reason." Her words echoed in Ethan's mind, stirring something uncomfortable. Yet, beneath the suspicion, a small flame of hope flickered. What if this was an opportunity? What if, for whatever reason, he was being given a chance to step into that other world, even if just for one night? "I think I should go," he said finally, surprising even himself with his determination. Mrs. Patterson looked like she wanted to object, but instead she sighed deeply. "If you're set on going, then we'll make sure you're prepared." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden charm in the shape of a bear, her late husband's lucky charm. "Take this with you, for protection." Ethan accepted the charm with reverence, knowing how much it meant to her. "I'll be careful," he promised. News of the invitation spread through East Riverdale like wildfire. By afternoon, a community effort had mobilized. Mr. Ramirez from the thrift store promised to find Ethan a suit. Ms. Chen from the alterations shop offered to tailor it. Even Old Man Jenkins, who rarely left his apartment, sent down his best pair of polished shoes, which surprisingly fit Ethan perfectly. As the community rallied around him, Ethan felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for their support, excitement about the opportunity, and a nagging anxiety about what awaited him at the Thompson estate. That evening, as he climbed to his usual spot on the rooftop, the skyscrapers seemed both closer and more intimidating than ever before. One of them, the tallest one with a distinctive blue-tinted glass exterior, was the Thompson Tower, where William Thompson's offices occupied the top floors. Somewhere in that glittering expanse was the man whose son had, for reasons unknown, decided to invite Ethan Miller from East Riverdale to his birthday party. Little did Ethan know that crossing the Riverdale Bridge would change his life in ways he could never have imagined, setting in motion events that would test not only his resolve, but also the very foundation of the barriers that divided his city. The countdown to Saturday had begun, and with it, the first chapter of a story that would either lift Ethan to new heights or confirm Mrs. Patterson's worst fears, that people from that side of the bridge rarely had good intentions for those from this side. By Saturday evening, Ethan barely recognized himself in the mirror. The community's collective efforts had transformed him from an auto mechanic into someone who looked like he belonged at a high society event. Mr. Ramirez had found a vintage tuxedo that fit surprisingly well after Ms. Chen's skilled alterations. His usually unruly brown hair had been expertly styled by Letitia from the salon down the street, who had refused to accept payment, saying, "You just remember us when you're hanging with those fancy people." Mrs. Patterson circled him critically, adjusting his bow tie for the third time. "Remember what we talked about," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Keep your eyes open. Don't accept any drinks you haven't seen poured, and if something feels wrong..." "I leave," Ethan finished for her. "I know, Mrs. P. I'll be careful." She nodded, then pressed a small flip phone into his hand. "It's Marco's old one. He put some minutes on it. Call if you need anything. Anything at all." The phone was outdated by at least a decade, but to Ethan, it represented the care and concern of his community. He slipped it into his inner pocket, alongside Mrs. Patterson's wooden bear charm. Outside, a murmur of excitement rippled through the small crowd that had gathered to see him off. Mr. Jenkins had insisted on driving him in his ancient but meticulously maintained Cadillac, saying, "You can't show up to a Thompson shindig in a taxi, boy." As Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, he felt a strange mix of emotions, like he was both betraying his community by stepping into that other world and representing them at the same time. The weight of their expectations and concerns sat heavy on his shoulders. "You know," Mr. Jenkins said as they pulled away from the curb, the community center growing smaller in the rearview mirror, "I worked construction on the Thompson Tower back in '89, broke my back putting up those fancy blue windows, and all I got was a pink slip when the job was done." He glanced at Ethan. "Don't let them fool you with their shine, son. Gold plating often hides the cheapest metal." Ethan nodded, storing away the old man's wisdom as they approached the Riverdale Bridge, the physical barrier between East Riverdale and downtown. As they crossed it, the change was immediate and stark. Potholed roads gave way to smooth asphalt. Graffiti-covered walls were replaced by manicured hedges. Corner stores became boutiques with names Ethan couldn't pronounce. The Thompson estate sat on a hill overlooking the city, a massive property surrounded by wrought iron gates and stone walls. As they approached, Ethan caught his breath. The mansion looked like something from a movie. Sprawling white stone with columns, perfectly symmetrical windows glowing with warm light, and a circular driveway where luxury cars were being valeted by attendants in crisp uniforms. "Good Lord," Mr. Jenkins whistled. "You could fit the entire community center in their living room." When their turn came at the gate, a security guard bent down to peer into the old Cadillac with barely concealed disdain. "Name?" he asked curtly. "Ethan Miller," Ethan replied, fighting to keep his voice steady as he presented the invitation. The guard examined it carefully, then checked a tablet. "You're clear to proceed," he said, sounding surprised. "Follow the driveway to the front entrance." As they pulled up to the mansion, Ethan felt like every eye was on them. The contrast between Mr. Jenkins' weathered Cadillac and the gleaming luxury vehicles couldn't have been more stark. "I'll be fine from here," Ethan said, turning to the old man. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Jenkins." The old man gripped Ethan's shoulder. "Remember who you are, son, and remember where you come from." With those words echoing in his mind, Ethan stepped out of the car and approached the grand entrance, where two massive doors stood open, revealing a glimpse of crystal chandeliers and marble floors. A butler in a tailcoat stood at attention. "Invitation, sir?" the butler asked, his tone neutral but his eyes taking in Ethan's appearance with a professional assessment. Ethan handed over the invitation, suddenly hyper-aware of his calloused hands so different from the manicured ones of the other guests flowing past him. "Mr. Ethan Miller," the butler announced, returning the card. "Welcome to the Thompson estate." Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped over the threshold, entering a world he had only ever observed from a distance. The interior of the mansion was even more opulent than he had imagined. The ceiling soared at least 20 feet high, adorned with intricate moldings and massive chandeliers that cast prismatic light across the marble floor. The grand foyer opened into various rooms where guests mingled, their laughter and conversation creating a sophisticated hum. Women in designer dresses and men in impeccable suits moved through the space with an ease that came from belonging. Ethan had never felt more out of place in his life. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, more to have something to do with his hands than out of any desire to drink. As he took a tentative sip, he scanned the room, wondering why on earth he had been invited here. "You look lost," came a female voice from behind him. Ethan turned to find a young woman regarding him with curious eyes. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her dark hair falling in loose waves to her shoulders. Unlike the other women at the party, she wore minimal jewelry, just small diamond studs in her ears. "That obvious, huh?" Ethan said with a self-deprecating smile. "Don't worry, half the people here are lost too. They're just better at hiding it." She extended her hand. "I'm Olivia Chen." Ethan took her hand, noting her firm grip. "Ethan Miller." A flash of recognition crossed her face. "Ah, the mysterious Ethan Miller. You're causing quite a stir, you know." "I am?" She nodded, taking a sip of her drink. "Nobody can figure out why you're on the guest list. The theories range from you being Jackson's secret half-brother to you saving his life in some heroic incident." Ethan laughed nervously. "I hate to disappoint, but I've never even met Jackson Thompson. I have no idea why I was invited." Olivia's expression shifted subtly, a slight furrow appearing between her brows. "That's interesting." Before she could elaborate, the crowd began to part like the Red Sea, and Ethan saw why. William Thompson himself was making his way through the room, a commanding presence in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Beside him walked a younger man who could only be Jackson Thompson. Same confident posture, same penetrating gaze, though his face held a boyish charm his father's lacked. They were heading straight for Ethan. "Mr. Miller," William Thompson's voice was deep and resonant, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard. "I'm so glad you could join us this evening." Ethan straightened his posture instinctively. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Thompson. You have a beautiful home." William's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Jackson was quite insistent that you attend." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted." As William moved away, Ethan found himself face to face with Jackson Thompson, heir to the Thompson fortune, and apparently the reason he was standing in this mansion instead of sitting on the community center rooftop. "Ethan Miller," Jackson said, his tone unreadable. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." "I wish I could say the same," Ethan replied honestly, "but I'm afraid I don't understand why I'm here." Jackson's smile widened, a gleam in his eye that made Ethan's stomach tighten. "All in good time, Ethan. All in good time. For now, enjoy the party. The main event doesn't begin until later." With that cryptic statement, Jackson moved on to greet other guests, leaving Ethan with a growing sense that Mrs. Patterson's warnings might have been well-founded. He felt eyes on him from all directions, some curious, some amused, some openly hostile. Olivia reappeared at his side. "That was odd," she murmured. "You're telling me, Ethan," replied, his grip tightening on his champagne glass. "What did he mean by the main event?" Olivia shook her head. "I don't know, but Jackson's parties always have some sort of entertainment planned. Last year, he brought in a famous mentalist who revealed embarrassing secrets about half the guests." Ethan's unease deepened. He thought of the wooden charm in his pocket, of Mrs. Patterson's concern, of Mr. Jenkins's warning about gold plating hiding cheap metal. Everything in him was screaming that he should leave now, before whatever was planned could unfold. But another part of him, the part that had spent years staring at these skyscrapers from a distance, wondering what life was like on this side of the bridge, wanted to stay, to understand why he had been brought here to face whatever challenge awaited him. As the evening progressed and more guests arrived, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of some elaborate setup, a pawn in a game whose rules he didn't understand. He just hoped he would discover the truth before it was too late to walk away. The party was in full swing when a crystal-clear chime rang through the grand ballroom, silencing the orchestra and drawing all eyes to the center of the room. Jackson. Thompson stood on a small raised platform, microphone in hand, his expression one of practiced charm and barely contained excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as honey, "thank you all for coming to celebrate my 25th birthday. As you know, Thompson parties are never ordinary." A knowing murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan felt Olivia tense beside him. "This doesn't sound good," she whispered. "Tonight," Jackson continued, "I've arranged something special. A little social experiment, if you will." His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ethan. "Would Mr. Ethan Miller please join me on the stage?" The crowd parted again, all faces turning toward Ethan. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he stood frozen in place. "Go on," Olivia nudged him gently. "Whatever he's planning, it's better to face it head-on." Drawing a deep breath, Ethan made his way through the crowd, feeling the weight of hundreds of curious stares. As he stepped onto the platform, Jackson draped an arm around his shoulders in a gesture that might have seemed friendly to onlookers, but felt possessive and controlling to Ethan. "Most of you are wondering who this young man is," Jackson addressed the crowd. "Allow me to introduce Ethan Miller from East Riverdale." The words East Riverdale triggered a reaction, raised eyebrows, exchanged glances, a few poorly disguised smirks. Ethan fought the urge to shrink back, instead straightening his posture and meeting the gaze of those watching him. "Ethan works as a mechanic at a small auto shop," Jackson continued, his tone carrying a hint of condescension. "He fixes cars with salvaged parts and dreams of crossing the bridge one day. Isn't that right, Ethan?" Ethan's jaw tightened. How did Jackson know these details about his life? "Something like that," he replied, keeping his voice level. Jackson's smile widened. "I've brought Ethan here tonight because I believe in giving opportunities to those less fortunate, and I'd like to offer him one right now." A server appeared with a silver tray. On it lay a simple broom, the kind used by janitorial staff throughout the mansion. "Ethan," Jackson said, now addressing him directly while ensuring his microphone caught every word, "I understand you help maintain the community center in East Riverdale. Perhaps you could demonstrate your skills for us. The marble in the East Wing could use a good sweeping." A wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. The humiliation was deliberate, calculated. This, then, was the main event. Ethan Miller, the charity case from across the bridge, brought in to be Jackson Thompson's entertainment. Time seemed to slow as Ethan stared at the broom. He thought of Mrs. Patterson's warning, of the community's efforts to prepare him for this night, of their pride and hope. He thought of the countless nights he'd spent watching these skyscrapers from the rooftop, imagining a world he could never access. But most of all, he thought of his mother, a woman who had cleaned other people's houses with dignity until her final days, who had taught him that no honest work was beneath anyone. With deliberate movements, Ethan reached for the broom. The crowd's laughter grew louder, more confident. Jackson's smile turned triumphant. But instead of taking the broom to sweep as instructed, Ethan held it upright beside him, almost like a staff or scepter. "You know," he said, his voice clear and steady despite not having a microphone, "my mother taught me something important before she passed away. She said that the true measure of a person isn't found in what they own or where they live, but in how they treat others." The laughter faltered as guests exchanged uncertain glances. "This broom," Ethan continued, running his hand along the wooden handle, "represents honest work. The kind of work that built this mansion, that keeps it clean, that maintains the cars you drive and the buildings you own. It's the kind of work that holds Riverdale together, both sides of the bridge." A hush fell over the room. Even Jackson's smile had faded. "I'm not ashamed to hold this broom, Mr. Thompson. I'm proud of where I come from and the people who raised me. The question is..." He looked Jackson directly in the eyes. "Are you proud of what you've done?" "Here tonight?" For a moment, no one moved or spoke. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single person began to applaud. Ethan spotted Olivia, her eyes shining with something that looked like respect. Gradually, others joined in, uncertain at first, then with growing confidence. Jackson's expression hardened. This was not how his social experiment was supposed to unfold. He quickly retook control of the microphone. "Well said, Mr. Miller. Very inspirational." His tone had shifted to something sharper, more challenging. "But talk is cheap, isn't it? Let's see if you're as clever as you are righteous." He snapped his fingers and a server appeared with another tray. This one held a chessboard already. "Set up for play. I understand you're pursuing education despite your circumstances. Let's test that intellect of yours. A simple game of chess. If you win, I'll donate $50,000 to your community center. If you lose, well, you go back across the bridge and never return." Murmurs rippled through the crowd again, some of excitement, others of discomfort, at the increasingly obvious cruelty of the entertainment. Ethan had played chess at the community center for years. Old Mr. Geller, a retired mathematics professor, had taught him the game and honed his skills through countless matches. But Ethan had no illusions about beating Jackson, who had likely received professional coaching in the game like everything else. Still, $50,000 could replace the community center's leaking roof, update its ancient heating system, and fund the after-school program for years. "Deal," Ethan said, setting the broom aside and taking a seat at the small table that had been brought onto the platform. Jackson looked momentarily surprised by Ethan's confidence, but quickly recovered. "Excellent. I should warn you, I was the state junior champion for 3 consecutive years. I'll try to make it interesting," Ethan replied with a calmness he didn't entirely feel. The crowd gathered around as Jackson, playing white, made his opening move, a standard King's Pawn opening. Ethan responded with the Sicilian defense, a choice that made Jackson raise an eyebrow. "You've studied," he remarked. "When you can't afford Netflix, chess is pretty good entertainment," Ethan replied. A few chuckles came from the audience, and Ethan sensed the mood shifting. No longer was he just the poor kid from across the bridge. He was becoming a character in an unexpected drama, someone to root for. As the game progressed, Ethan surprised both Jackson and the onlookers with his strategic play. For each aggressive move Jackson made, Ethan had a thoughtful counter. The game became a metaphor for the evening itself, wealth and privilege against resilience and ingenuity. William Thompson had joined the spectators, watching with narrowed eyes as his son found himself increasingly on the defensive. Beside him stood a striking woman who could only be Jackson's mother, her expression unreadable behind a mask of perfect makeup. By the time they reached the middle game, sweat had begun to bead on Jackson's forehead. What had started as entertainment, a way to humiliate someone he saw as beneath him, had become a genuine challenge. And Jackson Thompson did not like to be challenged. "Check," Ethan said quietly, moving his bishop to threaten Jackson's king. Jackson's face flushed as he was forced to move his king to safety, disrupting his planned attack. The whispers among the crowd grew louder, more excited. This was turning into a true spectacle, but not the one Jackson had planned. From the corner of his eye, Ethan noticed Olivia watching intently, a small smile playing on her lips. But there was something else in her expression, a thoughtfulness as if she were seeing beyond the game itself to something larger. As they entered the endgame, with fewer pieces on the board and tensions at their highest, Ethan realized something crucial. Jackson wasn't just playing to win anymore, he was playing not to lose. And there was a world of difference between those two mindsets. "You know," Ethan said conversationally as he considered his next move, "in East Riverdale we don't have much, but we have each other. When someone's in trouble, the community comes together. Does it work that way up here too, Jackson? If you lose tonight, will these people still respect you tomorrow?" Jackson's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his queen. "Just make your move, Miller." 3 moves later, Ethan had Jackson's king trapped in a corner with no escape. "Checkmate," Ethan said quietly. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by an eruption of applause. Jackson sat frozen, staring at the board as if trying to find a move that didn't exist. His father's expression had darkened considerably, while his mother had the strangest look on her face, something almost like satisfaction. Rising to his feet, Ethan extended his hand across the board. "Good game." After a long moment, Jackson took it, his grip unnecessarily firm. "This isn't over," he muttered, low enough that only Ethan could hear. "The community center will be expecting that donation," Ethan replied, equally quietly. Dima. Evening had taken a turn no one had expected, least of all Ethan himself. As he stepped down from the platform, guests who had earlier avoided eye contact now approached to congratulate him. A respected attorney handed him a business card, mentioning internship opportunities. A university dean expressed interest in his educational pursuits. But amidst the sudden attention, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a powerful enemy. Jackson Thompson's humiliation had been public and complete, and men like Jackson weren't known for their forgiveness. As the party resumed, with the orchestra playing and champagne flowing once more, Ethan found himself wondering if his victory would ultimately prove more costly than defeat would have been. Ethan needed air. The congratulations, business cards, and sudden attention from people who'd been happy to laugh at him an hour earlier felt suffocating. He slipped away from the main ballroom, finding a quiet terrace that overlooked the Thompson estate's immaculately landscaped gardens. The night air was cool against his face as he leaned against the stone balustrade, trying to process everything that had happened. His hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the chess match and its unexpected outcome. "Quite the performance in there," came a voice from behind him. Ethan turned to find Catherine Thompson, Jackson's mother, and William's wife, stepping onto the terrace. In her early 50s, she carried herself with an elegance that spoke of old money rather than new. Unlike her husband and son, whose wealth seemed to exist to be displayed, Catherine wore it like a second skin, comfortable, natural, unassuming. "Mrs. Thompson," Ethan acknowledged with a slight nod, unsure of her intentions. She moved to stand beside him, gazing out at the gardens. "You know, not many people can humble my son. I've been waiting years for someone to do it effectively." Ethan glanced at her, surprised. "I wasn't trying to humble him, I was just defending myself." "Sometimes those are the most effective lessons." She turned to face him directly. "You're probably wondering why you were invited tonight." "The thought had crossed my mind," Ethan replied dryly. Catherine's laugh was genuine, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Jackson has been watching you for some time. He owns that building across from your community center, the one with the blue awnings." Ethan knew the building well. It housed an upscale coffee shop that had opened last year. the first sign of gentrification creeping into East Riverdale. "He's seen you on that rooftop," she continued, staring at the skyline night after night. It bothered him. The idea that someone from your neighborhood could want something more, could aspire to his world. In Jackson's mind, people should stay where they belong. "And where do I belong, Mrs. Thompson?" Ethan asked, a slight edge to his voice. "That," she said with a subtle smile, "is exactly the right question. And not just for you, but for Jackson as well." She reached into a small clutch purse and withdrew a business card, offering it to him. "I run a charitable foundation separate from my husband's business interests. We fund educational opportunities for promising students from underserved communities." Ethan accepted the card, reading the embossed text, "The Catherine Thompson Foundation for Educational Equity." "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, suspicious of another potential trap. "Because you've earned not just my attention but my respect tonight," she replied candidly. "And because I believe talent should be nurtured wherever it's found." She glanced back toward the ballroom. "My son intended to humiliate you tonight. Instead, you taught him a valuable lesson about underestimating others." Before Ethan could respond, the terrace doors opened again and Olivia stepped out, looking relieved to find him. "There you are," she said. "I was worried after you disappeared." She nodded respectfully to Catherine. "Mrs. Thompson." "Ms. Chen," Catherine acknowledged warmly. "I see you've met our guest of honor." "We found each other earlier," Olivia confirmed, "though neither of us knew quite what was in store." Catherine's expression grew more serious. "Olivia's father and I serve on several non-profit boards together. She has a good eye for character." She turned back to Ethan. "Consider my offer. Regardless of what happens next, you've proven you belong in any room in this city." With that, she nodded gracefully to them both and returned to the party. When they were alone, Olivia moved closer to Ethan. "What did she mean by regardless of what happens next?" she asked quietly. "I'm not sure," Ethan admitted, "but I have a feeling Jackson isn't done with me yet." Olivia's expression confirmed his suspicion. "You embarrassed him in front of everyone. Who matters in his world? The Thompsons don't forget things like that." "Great," Ethan sighed. "So much for my quiet life fixing cars." Olivia studied him for a moment. "You never wanted a quiet life. I saw your face during the chess game. You were alive in a way most people in that room never are." Her observation struck uncomfortably close to the truth. The challenge, the stakes, the feeling of stepping into an arena he'd only observed from a distance. It had awakened something in him. "What's your story anyway?" Ethan asked, deflecting. "You don't seem like the rest of them." A shadow passed over Olivia's face. "My father came to this country with nothing, built a tech company from scratch. Now he's worth hundreds of millions, and I'm expected to be the perfect daughter who justifies his sacrifices." She shrugged, looking out at the gardens. "I guess I understand both worlds, where you're from and—" She gestured toward the mansion. "All this." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from inside. Raised voices carried through the open terrace doors, one of them unmistakably Jackson's. Exchanging concerned glances, they moved back toward the ballroom. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The orchestra had stopped playing, and guests were gathered in a tense circle around Jackson and his father. William Thompson's face was flushed with anger, his voice low but intense as he berated his son. "Humiliated us in front of everyone," they caught as they approached. "If you can't handle simple entertainment at your own party without turning it into a spectacle, how can I trust you with the company?" Jackson's response was too quiet to hear, but his expression was a mixture of embarrassment and simmering rage. As William turned away dismissively, Jackson's eyes found Ethan in the crowd. The hatred in that gaze was unmistakable. "We should go," Olivia murmured, taking Ethan's arm. "Jackson's going to be looking for someone to blame, and you're the obvious target." Ethan nodded, but before they could move toward the exit, William Thompson's commanding voice rang out. "Mr. Miller!" The crowd parted again as William approached, his expression unreadable. Ethan braced himself, uncertain whether to expect an apology or an accusation. "Sir?" he responded, fighting to keep his voice steady. William studied him for a long moment, his eyes calculating. "That was quite impressive chess strategy for someone with your background." "Thank you," Ethan replied, recognizing the backhanded nature of the compliment but choosing not to challenge it. "I had a good teacher." William nodded thoughtfully. "My son made a promise regarding a donation to your community center. The Thompson family honors its commitments." He pulled a checkbook from his inside pocket, wrote with practiced efficiency, and tore out a check, handing it to Ethan. $50,000, as agreed. Ethan accepted the check, noting that William had made it out to East Riverdale Community Center rather than to him personally, a small but telling detail. "I appreciate you honoring the agreement, Mr. Thompson," Ethan said. "Business is business," William replied coldly. "Though I should warn you, you've made quite an impression tonight. Not all of it positive." "I didn't come here looking to make enemies," Ethan said. "And yet you have." William's gaze shifted briefly to where Jackson stood fuming, surrounded by his friends. "My son doesn't take defeat graciously. I suggest you watch your back when you return to East Riverdale. The Thompson influence extends far beyond this estate." With that ominous warning, William turned and walked away, leaving Ethan and Olivia standing at the center of curious stares and whispered conversations. "Definitely time to go," Olivia said, more urgently this time. They made their way toward the exit, Ethan clutching both the check and Mrs. Patterson's wooden charm, which seemed warm against his palm. As they reached the grand foyer, a young man in a Thompson security uniform approached them. "Mr. Miller," he said quietly, "I'm supposed to escort you out." "That won't be necessary," Ethan began, but the security guard leaned closer. "Trust me, sir. You want me to escort you. There are some people waiting outside who aren't officially on, Mum, the security team, if you understand my meaning." Ethan and Olivia exchanged alarmed glances. "This way," the guard continued, leading them not toward the main entrance but down a side corridor. "There's a service exit that leads to the eastern gardens. My car is parked nearby. I can drive you home." "Why would you help me?" Ethan asked, suspicious. The young man glanced over his shoulder. "Let's just say not everyone who works for the Thompsons appreciates how they treat people. Besides, my little sister attends the after-school program at your community center. Mrs. Patterson is good people." That was enough for Ethan. He nodded, and they followed the guard through a maze of service corridors until they emerged into the cool night air on the far side of the mansion. True to his word, the guard's modest sedan was parked nearby. They drove away from the Thompson estate. Ethan stared at the check in his hand, $50,000 made out to the place that had been his home for 7 years. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like the opening move in a much more dangerous game. The security guard, who introduced himself as David, insisted on driving them all the way back to East Riverdale. Olivia had surprised Ethan by asking to come along, saying she wanted to see the community center that had become the center of tonight's drama. "I've never actually been to East Riverdale," she admitted, as they crossed the bridge, the gleaming skyscrapers of downtown now behind them. "My father would have a fit if he knew I was here." "It's not what people from your side think," Ethan said, gazing out at the familiar streets. "It's not all gangs and drugs. It's just people trying to make it through each day with dignity." David navigated the streets with the confidence of someone who knew the area well. "My family lived here until I was 12, he explained. "Then my mum got a job as a housekeeper for the Thompsons. We moved to the gatehouse on their property." When they pulled up in front of the community center, Ethan was surprised to see lights still on inside despite the late hour. As they approached the entrance, the door burst open, and Mrs. Patterson rushed out, enveloping Ethan in a tight hug. "Thank God you're all right," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When you didn't answer the phone, we feared the worst." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out Marco's old flip phone. The battery had died at some point during the evening. "I'm sorry," he said, genuinely regretful at having caused her worry. "Things got complicated." Mrs. Patterson pulled back, studying his face carefully before turning her attention to his companions. Her eyes narrowed slightly at David's Thompson security uniform, but when Ethan explained how David had helped them, her expression softened. "And you must be Olivia," she said, extending a hand to the young woman. "Come in, all of you. The whole neighborhood is waiting to hear what happened." True to her word, the community center's main room was filled with people: Mr. Ramirez, Ms. Chen, Old Man Jenkins, Marco, and dozens of others who had contributed to getting Ethan ready for the party. Their eager faces fell silent as Ethan walked in, everyone waiting expectantly for his report. Taking a deep breath, Ethan recounted the events of the evening: the initial humiliation attempt with the broom, his speech about dignity and honest work, the chess challenge, his unexpected victory, and finally, William Thompson's warning and the check he now held in his hand. When he finished, the room erupted in a mixture of cheers, indignant exclamations, and concerned murmurs. Mrs. Patterson took the check from him with trembling hands, staring at the amount in disbelief. $50,000, she whispered. "This could fix the roof, update the heating system, buy new computers for the kids." "And make us a target," Marco pointed out, his expression serious. "If William Thompson warned Ethan to watch his back, we need to take that seriously." A somber mood settled over the gathering as the implications of Marco's words sank in. The victory they had been celebrating suddenly felt more complicated. "He's right," David said, speaking up for the first time since entering the center. "I've worked security for the Thompsons for 3 years. They don't make idle threats, and they have connections throughout the city. Police, city council, zoning board, you name it." "So what do we do?" Ms. Chen asked, her hands nervously working at a piece of fabric. "Return the money." "No," Ethan said firmly. "We earned that money fair and square. They made the challenge, not us. But we need to be smart about how we use it and how we protect ourselves going forward." Olivia, who had been quietly observing the community's interaction, stepped forward. "I might be able to help with that," she said. "My father's legal team owes me a favor, and they specialize in dealing with difficult situations involving powerful people." The offer surprised Ethan. "Why would you do that for us?" Olivia's eyes met his, steady and determined. "Because what I saw tonight wasn't just about a rich kid being petty. It was about something bigger, the invisible walls that divide this city, and the length some people will go to maintain them." She glanced around the room. "And because I saw more genuine community in this room in 5 minutes than I've seen at a lifetime of society events." Her words seemed to lift the mood slightly. Plans began to form. Mr. Ramirez knew a contractor who could start on the roof immediately. Ms. Chen had a cousin in banking who could advise them on protecting the funds. Marco suggested installing security cameras around the building. As the discussion continued, Ethan noticed Mrs. Patterson speaking quietly with David in a corner. After a few minutes, they approached him. "David has some concerning information," Mrs. Patterson said, her expression grave. David looked uncomfortable but straightened his shoulders. "Before I left tonight, I overheard Jackson talking with some of his friends. He mentioned something about East Riverdale Community Development Project." The name sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He had seen the signs recently posted on several buildings in the neighborhood, notices about property assessments and urban renewal initiatives. "What about it?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "It's a Thompson Enterprises project," David confirmed. "They've been quietly buying properties all over East Riverdale for the past year, using shell companies so no one would connect them to the Thompsons. The plan is to demolish most of the existing structures and build luxury condos and upscale retail spaces." A heavy silence fell over those who had gathered to hear this new information. "What about the people who live here?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David shook his head. "The project details I saw didn't address that, but based on similar developments they've done in other neighborhoods, they usually offer minimal relocation assistance, enough to satisfy legal requirements but not enough to help people stay in the area." Ethan felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. So tonight wasn't just about humiliating me, it was about sizing up potential opposition to their development plan. "Most likely," David agreed. "William Thompson doesn't do anything without multiple motivations." As this revelation spread through the room, the mood shifted from celebration to determination. This was no longer just about one night or one check. This was about the future of their community. Olivia, who had been listening intently, pulled out her phone. "I need to make some calls. My father may be part of the same social circle as the Thompsons, but he has very different views on development ethics, and he owes me for attending countless boring corporate functions over the years." As she stepped outside to make her calls, Ethan found himself looking at the community center with new eyes. The peeling paint, the mismatched furniture, the worn books on the shelves, all of it represented something precious, something worth fighting for. Mrs. Patterson placed a gentle hand on his arm, seeming to read his thoughts. "Whatever comes next, you did something important tonight. You showed them that we have dignity, that we have value. That won't change no matter what buildings they tear down." Ethan nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead, formulating strategies, considering options. The Thompson family had resources, influence and power. But East Riverdale had something they couldn't buy or bulldoze: community. Outside, dawn was breaking over the neighborhood. Ethan stepped onto the front steps of the community center, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the worn brick buildings of East Riverdale. In the distance, across the bridge, the glass skyscrapers of downtown caught the light, gleaming with their usual remote splendor. But something had changed. Those towers no longer represented an unreachable dream. Now they symbolized a challenge, one that Ethan was increasingly determined to meet. Olivia joined him on the steps, her expression both troubled and resolute as she put away her phone. "My father's interested in what's happening here," she said. "He's been looking for a way to counter some of the Thompsons' more aggressive development tactics for years. This might be it." "What does that mean for East Riverdale?" Ethan asked. "It means you're not alone in this fight," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "And it means things are about to get very interesting." As if to punctuate her words, a sleek, black car pulled up in front of the community center, the driver's window lowered, and Ethan recognized the stern profile of Catherine Thompson. The battle for East Riverdale had begun. Catherine Thompson exited her car with the same elegant composure she had displayed at the mansion, seemingly unbothered by the curious stares from those gathering on the community center steps. In the morning light, she looked somehow more approachable, dressed in a simple blazer and slacks rather than evening finery. "Mr. Miller," she greeted Ethan with a nod. "I see news travels quickly." "Mrs. Thompson," Ethan responded cautiously, "this is a surprise." "Not an unwelcome one, I hope." Her gaze shifted to Olivia. "Ms. Chen, I thought I might find you here as well. Your father called me 20 minutes. Oh." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "That was fast, even for him." "When Jonathan Chen and I find ourselves on the same side of an issue, we don't waste time," Catherine replied with a hint of a smile. She turned her attention back to Ethan. "I understand you've learned about my husband's plans for East Riverdale." Ethan nodded, studying her carefully. "David filled us in. What I don't understand is where you stand in all this." Catherine's expression grew serious. "William and I have been at odds over development ethics for years. It's one of many reasons our marriage exists primarily on paper these days." She glanced at the community center, taking in its worn exterior and the people gathered on its steps. "May we continue this conversation inside? What I have to share shouldn't be discussed on a public street." Mrs. Patterson, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. "Of course, please come in." Inside, the community center had transformed from last night's celebration to what looked like a war room. Maps of East Riverdale were spread across tables with people marking properties that had already been purchased by Thompson shell companies. Others were on phones, reaching out to neighbors, friends, and local business owners. Catherine took it all in with an impressed expression. "You work quickly." "We don't have the luxury of time," Marco pointed out, not bothering to hide his suspicion of their wealthy visitor. Catherine acknowledged this with a nod. "You're right. William plans to present the development proposal to the City Council next week. Once it's officially on record, it becomes much harder to stop." This news sent a ripple of urgent whispers through the room. Mrs. Patterson guided everyone to the center's small meeting area, where Catherine, Ethan, Olivia, David, and several key community members gathered around a circular table. "I'll be direct," Catherine began, placing a sleek tablet on the table. "I've opposed William's approach to urban development for years. He sees neighborhoods like East Riverdale as underutilized assets, land that could generate more profit with different occupants. I see communities with history, character, and inherent value." She activated the tablet, projecting documents onto the wall. "This is my husband's full development plan for East Riverdale. Phase 1 involves acquiring key properties, which he's nearly completed. Phase 2 is the City Council approval process, scheduled to begin next Friday. Phase 3 would begin immediate construction of luxury high-rises on the eastern edge, followed by gradual revitalization moving westward." Ethan studied the projected maps and timelines with growing concern. "This isn't revitalization, it's displacement. There's nothing here about what happens to the current residents." "Because they don't matter in this equation," Catherine said bluntly. "The financial projections assume complete replacement of the current demographic with higher income residents." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about buildings. It was about erasing a community. "Why are you showing us this?" Mrs. Patterson asked finally, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "What do you gain by betraying your husband's plans?" Catherine met her gaze. "Directly. 20 years ago, I was an urban planning student with idealistic visions about community-centered development. Then I married William Thompson and watched those ideals get buried under profit margins and shareholder expectations." She gestured to the projected plans. "This is my chance to finally stand up for what I once believed in." "And the fact that it would undermine your husband's project is just a bonus?" Marco asked skeptically. A flash of something, pain perhaps, or long suppressed. Anger crossed Catherine's face. "Let's just say that after last night's events, the timing feels appropriate for all parties involved." Olivia leaned forward. "My father's already looking into legal challenges to the development, but having the actual plans helps immensely." Legal challenges might delay things, but they won't stop William, Catherine warned. "He has half the judges in the city in his pocket, and the other half are afraid to cross him." "Then what do you suggest?" Ethan asked. Catherine's expression turned. Thoughtful. "William's approach has always been to work behind closed doors, making deals in private, before anything becomes public knowledge. His greatest vulnerability is transparency, having his methods exposed to public scrutiny." "You're suggesting we take this to the media?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Not just any media," Catherine replied. "Rebecca Winters at the Riverdale Guardian. She's been investigating William's development practices for years, but hasn't had enough concrete evidence to publish." David, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Mr. Thompson won't take this," lying down. "If you go public, he'll retaliate hard. He already threatened me last night," Ethan pointed out. "How much worse could it get?" The room fell uncomfortably silent. "Much worse," Catherine said softly. "William doesn't just attack his opponents, he systematically dismantles them. Jobs lost, loans called in, leases terminated, reputations destroyed. Then we need to make sure our first move is decisive," Ethan said, a determination settling over him. "If we're going to challenge William Thompson, we need to do it in a way that makes it impossible for him to fight back without exposing himself further." Over the next several hours, a plan took shape. Catherine would provide Rebecca Winters with the development documents and background on previous Thompson projects that had displaced communities. Olivia would connect them with her father's legal team to find zoning violations and procedural missteps in the Thompson plans. David would gather testimonies from other Thompson employees about questionable business practices, but the centerpiece of their strategy came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson, who had been quietly listening as the others discussed legal, angles and media strategies, suddenly straightened in her chair. "We're thinking too narrowly," she said, cutting through the technical discussion. "This isn't just about stopping a development project. It's about two visions of what Riverdale should be." She moved to the wall where community photos were displayed, Children playing in the center's after-school program, seniors teaching cooking classes, neighbors helping repair each other's homes after a storm. This is what William Thompson doesn't understand about East Riverdale. We don't just live here, we belong to each other. She turned to face the group. Instead of just fighting against his development, we need to propose an alternative. A community-led development plan that preserves what matters while still addressing the neighborhood's real needs. Ethan felt a surge of pride as he watched understanding dawn on the others' faces. This wasn't just defensive action, it was reclaiming their agency, their right to determine their own future. "Mrs. Patterson is right," he said. "If we only focus on stopping Thompson's plan, we're still letting him set the agenda. We need to present our own vision for East Riverdale, one that includes the people who already live here." Catherine was nodding, a new respect in her eyes as she looked at Mrs. Patterson. "I know urban planners who specialize in community-centered development. They could help translate your vision into the technical language the City Council understands. And my father's foundation could potentially fund aspects of the project," Olivia added, "especially the educational and small business incubation components." As the conversation shifted from resistance to creation, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced before, a fusion of the two worlds he had always seen as separate. The resources and expertise of downtown were combining with the heart and authenticity of East Riverdale, creating something neither could have achieved alone. By late afternoon, their plan was ready. They would move simultaneously on multiple fronts: legal challenges to delay the Thompson proposal, media exposure of his methods, and the presentation of their own community-centered development alternative. Each aspect addressed a different vulnerability in William Thompson's approach, creating a comprehensive challenge to his power. As the meeting broke up and people dispersed to their assigned tasks, Ethan found himself standing with Olivia by the community center's front windows, watching as Catherine Thompson got into her car. "Do you think this will work?" Olivia asked quietly. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I know we have to try." He turned to face her. "Why are you doing this? You're risking a lot by standing against the Thompsons." Olivia was silent for a moment, her gaze distant. "My father came to this country with nothing, but he never forgot where he came from. He taught me that wealth is only valuable if it serves something greater than itself." Her eyes met Ethan's. "Last night, when I saw how Jackson treated you, how he saw you as nothing but entertainment, something in me rebelled against the world I've been part of without questioning." Ethan understood. In different ways, they were both crossing boundaries, challenging the barriers that had divided their city for generations. "Whatever happens next," Olivia continued, "I'm glad I was at that party last night. I'm glad I met you." Before Ethan could respond, Mrs. Patterson called him over to help coordinate the community outreach efforts. The next week would require every ounce of their collective energy and resources. As word spread throughout East Riverdale about the Thompson development plan and the community's response, something remarkable began to happen. People who had never been involved in community matters stepped forward to help. Shop owners offered their spaces for planning meetings. Teenagers volunteered to distribute information. Former residents who had moved away returned to stand with their old neighborhood. By Thursday, 3 days before the city council meeting, their alternative development plan was ready. It preserved the existing housing stock while allowing for thoughtful growth, created space for local businesses alongside new commercial opportunities, and included provisions for education, healthcare, and green spaces. It wasn't just a rejection of William Thompson's vision, it was an assertion of East Riverdale's own identity and worth. That evening, Ethan once again climbed to the rooftop of the community center. The skyscrapers of downtown still gleamed in the distance, but they no longer seemed like symbols of an unreachable world. Now they were simply buildings. Impressive, yes, but no more inherently valuable than the modest structures of East Riverdale. He heard footsteps on the fire escape and turned to see Olivia joining him, a folder of documents in her hand. "Rebecca Winters loved our story," she said, sitting beside him on the edge of the roof. "The Guardian is running it as their Sunday front page. Two visions for Riverdale's future. Catherine's documents, combined with the personal stories from the community, made for what Rebecca called the most compelling urban development narrative she's seen in years. Ethan smiled, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. William Thompson won't go down without a fight. No, Olivia agreed, but for the first time he's fighting on our terms, not his. Our terms. The phrase struck Ethan. Somehow, in less than a week, the barriers that had separated their worlds had begun to crumble. Not completely. There were still vast differences in power and privilege, but enough to create a shared purpose, a common ground. As the sun set over Riverdale, casting long shadows across both sides of the bridge, Ethan realized that regardless of what happened at Monday's city council meeting, something fundamental had already changed. The invisible wall that had divided the city for generations had been breached, and through that breach, a new possibility had emerged, not of one side dominating the other, but of a city that could belong to all its residents. The chess game that had begun at Jackson Thompson's birthday party was approaching its endgame. But unlike that match, this one would determine not just personal victory or defeat, but the future of an entire community. And this time Ethan wasn't playing alone. Standing on that rooftop, looking out at the city that had always been his home yet had never fully belonged to him, Ethan made a silent promise. To Mrs. Patterson, to East Riverdale, and to himself. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, with the dignity and resilience that had always been the true wealth of their community.